Just putting it out there, Celebrimbor is like the coolest name to say out loud. Celebrimbor. Gotta like have that like sound at the back of your throat when you say his name. Celebrimbor. This is fun. Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and I am here belatedly to finally review the first 3 episodes of Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2 that were released last week. Those episode titles are Elven Kings Under the Sky, Episode 2 Where the Stars Are Strange, and Episode 3 The Eagle and the Spectre. Scepter? Scepter. I can read good. Anyways, first off, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the review, I just want to say I am sorry that this review is coming out so late. I actually was traveling last week with a friend across country because she needed someone to come with her for safety reasons. And I just wanted to get out of the house and get out of my own head for a little bit. So it was a really fun time. We had fun watching the show as we were traveling, but it didn't mean I wasn't able to get home and actually film anything until right now. And on top of that, I'm just going to forewarn, I actually have a minor surgery this Thursday, the week that this video is coming out. Nothing serious and nothing like trans related or anything like that, just a health thing. But I probably will also not be getting out my review for this week's episode until next week as well, because I'll probably be in a decent amount of pain for a few days. So wish me well, I'll be fine, I'm not too worried about it. But just forewarning that I'll be a little bit behind on next episode's review as well. And then we'll be getting into a more regular cadence for the rest of the season, which is only 4 more episodes because they released 3 at one time. 2, I can see the argument for, but 3, like, it's like the seasons are so short, and now it's like already halfway over. All that said, getting into it, I'm going to kind of give generalized thoughts overall, and then I'll get into some of the nitty-gritty. There's 3 episodes, so I probably won't go through every little bit and piece, as I will for future episodes. But I'll just try and give some specific thoughts as we go through. But staying overall for right now, I have to say, I think this season is a vast improvement over season 1. For those of you who didn't watch my season 1 reviews, my general takeaway from that season was, personally, I actually ended up being positive on the show. But I was very well aware of all the flaws of the show, and very much understood why those flaws would push people away. I think the big things that stuck out to me were I hated the mystery box element of the show. I mean, it's fine to have one mystery box or something like that, but the show had so many of like, who is Sauron? Who is the stranger? What is going on in the Southlands with that little sword thingy? Who is Adar? Like, it was just a lot of mystery box, like, ooh, what's going on here storytelling. And, you know, when you do that, it leads your story to feel listless and unfocused, and also feel like you can't invest in anything because you don't actually know what's going on. Like, a bit of mystery is cool, but having that be the overriding feeling is, it's hard to invest. And I think immediately, this season fixes that problem right off the bat, because we now know who Sauron is. We have Halbrand. And I think just giving Halbrand that, like, we're aware of who he is now, I think does so much for the show. I mean, the whole framing of this season, honestly, has kind of put Halbrand as almost the protagonist of the show. And knowing that we're ultimately going to be going towards a darker kind of end for this series, it provides this show with a very interesting narrative thrust that's like, oh, we're seeing him manipulate people and sort of push things towards this end that we know is coming. And by doing that, it kind of creates this like foreboding tragedy to this entire season that I think gives it just a sense of character and a sense of direction that season 1 really was lacking. And frankly, I really enjoy Halbrand. The first episode where we get to see him kind of manipulating Adar, and we get to sort of see him trying to manipulate Adar into siding with him, and the way he like worms his way around things, like when Adar tells him that you need to bow down to me and submit yourself to me, and Halbrand, Sauron, kind of twists the words and says, like, I will serve the Lord of Mordor to the end of my days and his. And he means that that gives him an out to serve the Lord of Mordor, which we all know will eventually be him. It's just a fun dynamic that I think adds so much more. And just seeing him being evil is fun. Like that smile he gives at the end, he manipulates that warg into killing the guy who wronged him. It was just a petty thing, and you just see that smile from a distance, and how we're just so pulled back from him. I think was just such a cool choice to like, oh, we're seeing him from a distance, and he's kind of awful. I think is really cool. And then you also get in the first scene of the episode where we go back in time to the beginning of the Second Age, and we see him be killed by Adar and turned into the worm monster from Princess Mononoke. I think provides a level of sympathy for him that I find to be very interesting. And I also really love, his manipulation of Celebrimbor. Celebrimbor willingly brings him on through his very interesting manipulation of Celebrimbor's ego, and I found that to be really a much better way to go, and provides like the him turning into Elven Jesus at that moment, kind of as an interesting sort of manipulation into that. I also love Celebrimbor just being moved by the rings having worked, but it was playing to this desire to do good and showcase his art that Sauron was playing off of. Also, I just found it really funny when Celebrimbor dropped the wine in that scene. I was like, oh, no, not the first stage wine. Oh my boy. Also, just a silly thing. I loved Celebrimbor's weird umbrella that guy was holding for him. I just found that very funny. And normally those types of stories of like miscommunication stories would bother me, and there's other miscommunication stories in this season that do bother me. But it works here because Sauron is a master of manipulation. That's what he's supposed to be. And so he would try to deliberately leave out misinformation or change context and push narratives in his way and use half-truths. And I think it's very well done, I think, overall in that side of things. That being said, some of the problems of season 1 are very much still present here that very much bug me. I think the biggest, most prominent one comes in episode 3, which is Númenórean politics. Frankly, I don't give a shit about Númenórean politics, which is sad because I always wanted to see Númenor. I was always very excited. I was excited in season 1 we got to see it, but the politics in season 1 were so half-baked and very much like, they took our jobs sort of thing, and none of the characters in season 1 were all that interesting to me from Númenor, even like Isildur and Isildur's dad and all that, the family stuff and the prince. Like, I didn't care. Like, it was hard to invest in anything. And this season, coming back in episode 3, starts to double down on it, and it does have that sort of miscommunication thing where, like, you have the one, I don't even remember her name, but, like, the daughter who is basically like, I'm going to do this for Isildur, and he's dead, and it's the queen's fault, so I'm going to help the other guy, get ahead. And it's like, Isildur's alive. We see that in this episode, and we all know that as the audience, even before we see him be alive. It's Isildur. And so just that sort of like miscommunication thing, like it always just, that frustrates me, where it's like if people would just talk or just have a piece of information that would be fairly easy to get, they would understand it, and they don't have the complicating factor of someone like Sauron pushing them that way. And as a result, that sort of storytelling frustrates the hell out of me. And it's compounded by the fact that I just don't give a crap about Númenórean politics to begin with. It is better this season, because it is a little bit more focused. It's less on the, like, very lame, like, they took our jobs, we hate the elves, like, sort of xenophobia that was very not well expressed, not very well thought out, not very nuanced, not very deep or intriguing. And it makes it more about, like, grappling for power. And I think those are more interesting dynamics, at least ones that rely less on, shitty, very simplistic politics, but and makes it more personal at the very least. But it's still not, it's still just very, like, paint by numbers. It's like, it's nothing very deep or super intriguing. Also, episode 3 brings in another element of season 1 that I didn't really like, which was the Arondir and Theo storyline. We do have Bronwyn having died in between seasons, or at the start of episode 3. I think mainly because the actress who played Bronwyn didn't want to come back. And you can kind of see the show swerving just to do that, because it was sort of like, oh, she was doing better. Oh, I guess she died now between seasons because the poison was just something I didn't account for. It works worse in men than it does in elves, as Arondir said. So yeah, it's just sort of like them swerving because the actress didn't want to come back. But still, even without Bronwyn, who I didn't really care all that much about, I just don't care much about Arondir or Theo. And Isildur I care a little bit more about, and I have a little bit more intrigue into that storyline, but I am still not loving his character. I'm not super invested in his character. And this drama with this woman that he meets that might potentially be working for Adar, I think it's just, I don't know. I'm just not intrigued at all. So really, episode 3 especially kind of left me being like, I still don't care about any of these storylines, and I'm much more interested in the rest of the stuff going on. However, what to go back to positives, what I do really like are just some of the poetic choices that the season makes. You know, I see a lot of good faith, and we'll talk about some bad faith reviews of the show later on, because I stepped in the discourse accidentally on Twitter a few days ago from anti-woke brigade folks. I'll mention that. But some good faith criticism that I've seen from like critics I respect have been comparing Lord of the Rings of Power to something like House of the Dragon. And while House of the Dragon is has its own issues this season, I did a podcast called Cast of Kings, where I was a guest host on that, if you want to hear my thoughts on that season. Generally liked it, but it had many of its own problems. And I understand why I'm making the comparison is there, but ultimately, at the end of the day, both Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings are very different fantasies, intentionally so by George R.R. Martin distinguishing himself from Tolkien. And I think both shows reflect that, in that House of the Dragon is very meant to be like very political, very grounded, and Rings of Power aims to have a bit more poeticism to it, and things being a bit more fantastical and less realistic. And again, that poeticism, I think, is just the big thing for me. I think that there's some really great moments within the season that I really like. I think one of the ones that sticks out the most for me is in the beginning of episode 3, where we have that sort of like sequence where we follow Isildur's horse. And we follow the horse on its journey to find Isildur. And there's also the bit where Nori and the stranger and Poppy get lost in a circle, and it kind of has this magical feel to it, that they're just magically stuck there, and they're only able to work their way out by following the Wandering Day song from season 1, which I think kind of brings in this sort of Tolkien-esque magic in music that I really liked, and tied in the song from season 1 that I think was a highlight of the musicality of season 1 in a really fun way that feels very Hobbit-like or Harfoot-like. Of course, the Harfoots would use music to remember their path out of like a magical circle. And I think the elements like that really fit within Tolkien's magic system and ways that he thought about the world of Middle-earth and how magic worked there. It's moments like that I really do appreciate what Rings of Power tries to be versus something like House of the Dragon. And I think ultimately, like, to compare the two as I think it's interesting to put those two things in conversation, but to compare them, I think ultimately does a disservice to both of them and what they're trying to do, especially if you're trying to compare them in order to say one is better than the other. And I think another element of this season that I really do like as well, that I loved in season 1 as well, is the dwarves. Again, we have the stone singing element here that comes into play as the Khazad-dûm is now facing an existential crisis as their sun shafts have fallen. I thought that was just such a cool idea. What I liked even more about it was that it wasn't just some like nebulous, like, oh, this thing is happening for blah, blah, blah reasons. It was directly because of the mountain in Mordor going off. I love that cause and effect. And as much as I thought the reason that the mountain going off because of that sword thingy, the key thing in season 1 was dumb, using it here as a direct cause and effect for this part, I think adds a larger sense of the grand scheme of Sauron to it all, and just the scope of Sauron's plans, that I think is really interesting. And there's this sense of decay and fear that is fueling everything, and when people act out of fear, they fall to Sauron's corruption because they're acting in self-preservation rather than trying to build something new. And I think that works very well in the Dwarven story. I do think the Durin and his father stuff, it has emotionally works very well. It has more depth to it than the Númenórean politics. There's more emotionality behind it than the characters that I really do think works. And also, I just gotta say, Disa is my fucking favorite. I love Disa to death. I love her yeah, I'm gonna sing and we're gonna figure this out, and like the despair she has, but also constantly pushing Durin to be like, work shit out with your father. I agree with you. I love you to death, but like we gotta focus. We gotta get things done. And I just love her her eye is always on the fucking ball, and I love that for her. And I just want to have Elrond come back into this dynamic, because I love season 1's dynamic of Disa being very much like, I love my husband and his elven boyfriend getting to be together. I adore that dynamic. And I think jumping over to the elven stuff with Galadriel and Gil-galad, Elrond, etc., That stuff, I think, works for me. It is not my favorite aspect of the show, but it kind of goes the same thing with the Doors, where Elrond presenting those rings are dangerous because Sauron may have had a hand in them. And, I've seen critique from people, and again, good faith critique, of, in the books, those rings were never corrupted. Like, Sauron never touched them, so they were always pure. And so bringing in this question of, like, Elrond having, like, maybe they're dangerous is sort of a sidetrack from that point and sort of adding stuff in that sort of, like, questions the validity of these rings in a way that wasn't present in Tolkien's work, at least to my awareness. And just to be clear, like, I love Tolkien. I can't pull it up here, but I have a Smaug tattoo right on my shoulder. Like, Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite things, but I'm also not, like, a hyper-fixated Tolkien scholar like I am with something like Star Trek, for example. So, like, I don't know everything. But I am a big fan. But that being said, I think it kind of goes back to that same theme of, like, corruption. Are we acting out of fear? What are we trying to preserve the old versus making something new? And that same idea being sort of the galvanizing factor for a lot of people, and how Sauron worms his way in, I think works. And I think the relationship between Gil-galad and Galadriel and Elrond, I think, is a more interesting dynamic between all of them that I think is solid. It's not the most interesting aspect to me, but I think it's a much stronger dynamic than season 1. Also, the Elven, I forget his name, but the Elven shipmaster guy, fucking daddy elf. Like, just saying, holy shit. Anyone else? Fucking hot. I'm usually not into, like, older guys, but, like, whew, hot damn. Anyways, I hope Aaron didn't hear that. My fiance. All of that, I think, was solid. It also leads me to another thing that I really love, that I have to call out, Bear McCreary's music. Bear McCreary, I have to just be open, my favorite composer of all time. I have been listening to his music since he was the Battlestar Galactica composer. I have a literal signed CD that I got him to sign way back in, like, 2008 at Comic-Con that I went to when I was a kid. Sorry, I just made people feel old. I still have that signed CD. I just saw him again this year. I got him to sign a vinyl that I have of Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power Season 1. I have his vinyl of Singularity, which y'all should listen to. So Bear McCreary fucking kicks ass, one of my favorite composers. And his music is beautiful. Like, the themes you hear come up at certain moments musically throughout this episode. Like, for example, I think, like, Galadriel at some point says, he played me like a harp. And you hear Sauron's theme come up through a harp. Just a bit on the nose, but, like, really beautiful. And then some of the vocalized parts, like Gil-galad singing, was gorgeous. I ended up listening to a bunch on the road trip. We were listening to some of his music and loved that. This might be a minor spoiler here, but we do see in episode 2, I believe, Adar talking to Dameron, who's a troll, and there is a song on the album called The Last Ballad of Dameron. And I have not listened to that song. Holy shit. It's like screaming, but like musical screaming, and it's so good. Like, please listen to it. I'm curious to see what that's going to be in the show itself. But man, it has me pumped. So Bear McCreary's music, just fan-fucking-tastic. The other element that I think I'm still more mixed on, just like I am with elves, but more negative on, is the stuff with the stranger, Nori and Poppy. Again, it's better because the stranger is less like, who am I? And we know he's good now. And it's a more directed narrative of, like, instead of him just nebulously wandering around figuring out who he is, they have a place to go. They're going to Ruin, and they're being chased by some people that are after them. Like, that provides a little bit more narrative thrust. I do think it's an improvement on season 1, especially since we get away from the Harfoots, which I did like the Harfoots, but, like, their culture, the way this culture was described is very weird. So I think that it's better, and I think there's some good comic relief there. It never reaches the heights of, like, say, Merry and Pippin, for example, or even Frodo and Sam. But I do find, like, some joy between those characters that I think is kind of fun. The Strange is a bit joyless for me. Like, I wish he had a little bit more playfulness. And there is still that dogged commitment to, like, we don't know who he is. So much so that there's, like, literally an on-the-nose line of, like, where Nori says, we'll figure out who you are when they're talking about names. Now, I think most people just presume he's Gandalf at this point. He said some lines with Gandalf. He has obviously a tie to the Harfoot, who become the Hobbits, which would explain Gandalf's Hobbit stuff. I will play devil's advocate and be like, maybe it's Sauron. I know more than likely it's Gandalf, but Sauron does go to the Shire at the end of The Return of the King in the books, and does the Scourging of the Shire. So like maybe something happens with the stranger that makes him angry at the hobbits or dislike the hobbits or have trauma from like maybe losing Nori and Poppy. I don't know. But it'd be an interesting twist if like, because Sauron was supposed to be good before he turned to Saruman. Sorry, I'm saying Sauron. Saruman, excuse me. Before Saruman turned to Sauron in Two Towers and Fellowship. So it would be an interesting twist if it was Saruman. I doubt it's one of the blue wizards, and I doubt it's Radagast or the twins. So it's either one of those two, Saruman or Gandalf. Probably Gandalf, but you know what? Devil's advocate, I'll stick on the Saruman train just for the shits and giggles of it as we go throughout the season. And we'll see who ends up being right. But yeah, we get to see a little bit more of Rune, which I do kind of enjoy. We get to see a dark wizard. It's okay. There's nothing super engaging me there, and I just kind of want to get them to get to the point. When they get to the point of it, I would like it doesn't not work, but I am sitting here being like, all right, let's get going. That said, there's some cool visuals there. The whole series is beautifully gorgeous. You can see that the money was put on screen. Like they really put the work in. And say what you will about the show, if you dislike it or not, it's gorgeous. And I think it's one of the best looking fantasy series I've seen, which I love. I like that it kind of respects that like Peter Jackson idea of like trying to make everything physically in a lot of ways, as opposed to something like The Hobbit, which is a lot more CGI. And I think this kind of like rides the line between the two of those, but I respect that there's a lot of intent put in the visuals, where between as opposed to something like The Hobbit, which felt more like studio mandated, like let's just get these done, instead of like a lot of thought put into it. And I say that as someone who enjoys the first two Hobbit movies. Don't get me started on the third one. Don't love them, but I enjoy them. This brings me to my last thing that I will talk about on its own terms, and I'll talk about the discourse that I stepped into. The orcs with Adar. Again, loved seeing the opening sequence with Elf Sauron getting killed and turning into the Princess Mononoke monster. And I really do think Adar is an interesting character of this first orc who has motivations to have the orcs exist on their own terms, to be their own society. And Sauron obviously over time going to be manipulating that and thrusting him aside. And I think him betraying Sauron at the beginning of the show, I think adds an interesting context to their history that's a lot of fun. And adds a lot of interesting intrigue to episode 1 and depth to that relationship, at least on Sauron's side, as Adar thinks he's Halbrand, that I think plays very well. And gives a lot more motivation and depth to Sauron as a character. And I also really like, here's I'll step in the discourse, the humanization of the orcs. Because we do get a quick little scene where we get to see an orc family and them showing concern of like Sauron coming back. I really like that. I think, I mean, if you go back and actually look at Tolkien's writings and Tolkien himself, he, after writing Lord of the Rings, had complicated feelings about a race of beings that were depicted within the story as inherently evil. And he always wanted to deal with that. And I think getting to actually do that in this show is a really interesting way to sort of break down this, like, they're all evil. Yes, they may be manipulated for evil at certain points, be ruled by an evil leader at some points, maybe have an inclination towards doing bad things because of their culture, their being, whatever, however you want to characterize it. But they are not inherently so, nor always so, nor just exist as gross little monster people killing each other all the time. And I think adding a depth to that is cool. It's not deep, it's not super deep, it's just kind of there. It's just sort of presented. But it implies more that I think adds a lot of depth to the orcs and to Adar. Now, of course, just to quick address it, Season 1 became very much a galvanizer for the anti-woke brigade. You know, they do this all the time. I've talked about it a bunch before, but the anti-woke brigade finds a show that a lot of people are watching that is not perfect, maybe even is bad, and has a lot of issues with it, certainly, understandable issues, and then they use it to direct it towards, you know, they hate you, they're destroying your culture, they're vandalizing Tolkien, they're destroying Western culture, they added black dwarves, like, whatever excuse they want to basically kind of push this, not just bigotry, which they directed at, like, the actress who played Disa, but also just to push this very conservative mindset that stories are perfect in amber and that we can never comment upon them, we can never change them, we can never adapt them, they're corrupting our culture sort of nonsense. And they are back in full force for Season 2. And I stepped in the capital of the discourse because I tweeted on Twitter about liking the humanization of the orcs. And of course, these folks are currently on this, like, Tolkien never wanted to humanize the orcs. They just wanted an evil being. They wanted a binary morality within Tolkien. And this is like, someone literally, Someone literally retweeted me being like, this is vandalizing Token. I'm like, first off, Token was interested in exploring this in his own work. Whether or not he fully got to do so by the time he passed away, he was interested in it. So fuck off with that, like Token wouldn't have wanted it. But even if he didn't, adaptations are allowed to comment upon something, and it is not vandalization of their work. It is a work of art that is made today by new writers, and they are allowed to explore new themes that use Lord of the Rings to comment upon previous work, to use the basis of Lord of the Rings to say new things. And I think this idea of like humanizing these people that culturally we view as like evil and dark, to express how like our culture writ large tends to dehumanize races of people and say they are inherently evil, I think that's worth discussing. Now, you have every right to say, this doesn't, like, I don't agree with this. You can even say, in my interpretation of Token, I don't think he would have wanted it. I think this is bad. I don't think it's good. I think that those are all worthwhile things to say and to feel. However, to make the argument that, like, to change anything about a work, to comment anything about a work, is somehow saying someone is vandalizing work, or is saying, like, somehow calling Token wrong or bad for doing so, I think is silly, number one. And number two, just ignores, like, very clearly the show has a love of Token. And maybe not the love of Token you like, you may not think they do express it well, that's your opinion, you're allowed to. But to say that, I think is just silly, and of course falls into those very conservative mindsets of like, the past must never be changed, we can't fix, everything has to stay the same, and we just want to repeat the same stories. I do agree that, like, I would much rather a new fantasy story than a prequel Lord of the Rings show. I'm enjoying the show quite a bit, but yeah, I do think we are in an era of way too many franchises, of this show just being an evidence of it's freaking adapted from appendices. So, like, yes, but given the assignment that these writers were given and the cultural landscape they were in, where only these types of shows are getting greenlit, I think they are doing the best they can in that term. You may like it or not, you may think the show is bad or not, I think that's totally fine. You have every right to do that. But to just attack it as like vandalism or saying it hates Token is just falling into that like antagonistic binary mindset that fuels the more bigoted shit, whether you believe the bigoted shit or not. Like, it's always about like, they're coming to get you, they're coming to destroy your culture. It's always these binary antagonists. So I stepped into that, and I just find it silly, and obviously having a much more sinister edge to it, but just on its face, it's a silly argument to me. I think that's everything that I'll end on. I'll end on that point, I guess. Like I said, just to wrap out, I am actually really enjoying this season so far. 3 episodes in, like, this isn't rocking my world. I'm not gonna sit here and argue that this show is like A+ grade A material. And certainly season 1, I think, was much worse, and I argue, like, it was a trash show, but it was my trash, and I kind of liked it, even though I understood why people would hate it. This season, I would actually argue, so far, is solid, and I'm enjoying it. Not the world's best thing, but, like, I enjoy what it is giving me, and it's feeding, and it feels different than the types of fantasy shows that we have been getting, especially something like House of the Dragon. And while it's not the world's best, I am enjoying this. And I think there's a much more solid sense of direction and purpose and story here, especially around Sauron's stuff, that makes me much more intrigued and much more earnestly excited for this season going forward. And I think there's a lot of artistry on display, even beyond some of the stuff that I have issues with, like Bear McCreary's art or the visual. So, on the whole, solid. Really enjoying it. I'm excited to hear your thoughts, though. Let me know down in the comments. Do you enjoy this season of Rings of Power so far? Let me know. Like I said, I will be releasing reviews for the entire season, but next week's review, or this week's review, I guess, at this point, will probably be a few days late, probably over the weekend, maybe early next week, and then we'll be on a more regular schedule from there. Wish me luck on surgery, and beyond all of that, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.